You're listening to a New Dimensions archive edition, recorded in 1992.
We live in a time when we think we can fix the psyche like repairing a flat tire. It's a legacy of the scientific age when all is reduced to mechanics, even our souls. Has the endless processing of our foibles through a myriad of therapeutic garbage compactors resulted in a better society, a better world? Our guests today haven't brought answers so much as they are bringing new questions to the ages-old dilemma, who am I? Why am I here? Our guests are James Hillman and Michael Ventura. James Hillman is a controversial Jungian psychologist who Robert Bly has called the most lively and original psychologist we've had in America since William James. He's the author of A Blue Fire, The Myth of Analysis and Revisioning Psychology. Michael Ventura is the cutting-edge and widely respected columnist for the LA Weekly and the author of Shadow Dancing in the USA and Nighttime, Losing Time. Together they have co-authored We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse. Join us for the next hour as we explore what therapy is and is not in the worlds of spirit and soul with our guests James Hillman and Michael Ventura. My name is Michael Toms. I'll be your host. Welcome to New Dimensions. Michael, James, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'd like to begin with your beginnings. How did the two of you come together and decide to start exploring the world of therapy together? How did that happen?
James and I met at a Robert Bly men's conference up in Mendocino and gradually kept crossing paths at lectures, conferences, and such.
And we read each other's things.
Right. We read each other's book. He read my book, and I read his books. And I was mentioning him to my editor, Kit Rackless, at the LA Weekly one day. In fact, we were trying to figure out the 100 best things to list of the 90s culturally. And I said, A Blue Fire, James Hillman. And the other people in the room went, what? And because mostly they're concentrating on rock and roll and movies, and those are their expertise and politics. And I realized none of the people I work with read psychology. It was interesting. And I started rapping about the book, and Kit said, well, you have to do a cover story on this guy since you're so enthusiastic about him and the rest of us don't know that world. So that became the original cover story. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. And that created a lot of talk up and down the town. In fact, it was talked about, that piece was talked about, I'm a screenwriter as well, or I have been. And I went to a meeting with Frank Mancuso Jr. the next morning after the piece came out. And he talked about a big argument at dinner. Okay, that was his world over that piece. At the paper, where we have a lot of punk-ish people in the punk music world, a young woman who works at the paper talked about a big argument about it in her world at a party that night where they almost came to blows, actually, she said. And so I thought, we have something here. If the people in Frank Mancuso's circle and the people in Katiri's circle are talking about all this, then we have something here. So gradually that grew into this book.
So James Hillman soon to be a movie, huh?
Yes. We're
So James, how is this for you, being discovered in this way by the LA Weekly and Hollywood, as it were?
Well, I'd say it was more being responded to by Michael, because he's an extraordinary interviewer. He doesn't interview you in the sense as it's always done everywhere, question and answer, adversarial. Well, what do you mean with that? Explain that. Give me an example. Define your terms. All those limiting. What Michael does is go with you as far as you want to go. So this became a book where we could each go as far as we wanted to go, or as far as it wanted to go in us. And that made a different kind of book. It's going over the edge. It's not just going to the edge.
So we should say that the book contains both dialogues between you and Michael, as well as letters between the two of you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Letters which we don't answer. We write letters. We want the other guy to read that letter, but we don't particularly answer his letter.
Yeah. There was something in there that in the book about therapy that fixing what's wrong represses the or. Could you explain that?
Well, the idea of processing everything doesn't give enough recognition to the ground material of structures that are part of your character. So Americans tend to go into therapy with the idea of transformation. That's become a T word for me. I mean, everything can be transformed, which means everything can become something else, which neglects what it is. It's not an exploration of what is. It's an attempt to process it. It's an industrial fantasy. Make it better. Value added. And we're born with certain structural nuggets that are the basis of our personalities, our differences, and our character. And I don't want mine messed with too much.
It's also where the psychotherapeutic community and in some ways the New Age community are mirroring the consumer culture. It is, you can transform, you can make of this what you will, which is exactly the same thing that the industrialists say of the earth, which is, and these parallels are not noticed, that we're trying to do with our psyches in certain spheres of life exactly what the industrialists are doing with the earth, what government is trying to do with power, and we're trying, James and I are trying to get at some of these blind spots, some of these mirrorings that psychotherapy is not aware of.
Do you think therapy can be revitalized, or we have to throw it out and start anew?
Well, whatever we think about that, it's going to do what it's going to do anyway.
But if you had your druthers?
Well, I wouldn't want to throw out anything. I'm not interested in throwing out therapy. I'm interested in throwing out its self-blindness, or throwing out, or working over its ideas, not stopping therapy. Many people go to therapy and will continue to go to therapy in order to, what do you say, Michael, about that? Whatever helps you get through the night?
Yeah, whatever gets you through the night, as Frank Sinatra, I think, said first, and then John Lennon took it from Frank Sinatra.
And if therapy helps you that way, there are many reasons for therapy. But the main thing is that therapy has got itself into a place where it's quite smug. And it feels it's the only, lots of things are bad in the culture. Politics is bad, education isn't working, the banking system's broken down, the military, industrial, all these things are bad, but therapy imagines itself as still good. And that produces a lot of smugness and smoothness.
But at the same time, there's no place in this book where we say don't go to therapy. Again and again, we say, yes, people have to do inner work. Yes, the therapists are doing a frontline job on a lot of this. We're not jettisoning, we're not throwing out that. What we're saying is therapy has blind spots, therapy has shadows, and these aren't being explored enough. And we're trying to make a beginning at some of those explorations.
This point's very important. After 12 years, particularly the last 12 political years since 1980, someone has to pick up the pieces of this trickle-down abuse. And therapy's had to do an awful lot of heavy-duty work of keeping the net underneath the society. So it's certainly not an attack on therapists.
Speaking of the abuse, I thought it was interesting the point you made about America, the government actually being a major national child abuser. I thought that was an interesting point. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, explain that a bit.
It's not only the government, it's the people who do not want to pay for education. I mean, the way we educate or fail to educate our children is a definite abuse of children. It's the responsibility of the adults in a society to educate the children. And we haven't taken that responsibility. We don't want to pay for that responsibility, and don't want to be taxed for it. Those are their children over there. We don't have to educate them. And so Yeah, go.
I was just wanting to say there is an education going on about the children. It's an education to become a consumer. It's an education to watch TV and to enter the society on that level
And
as a consumer. That's abusive, I believe.
And all of this is fundamentally abusive, but the only abuse that we're willing to look at as a society is the sexual abuse. Now, nobody is minimizing the sexual abuse or the damage, but the abuse of not educating people, the abuse of chaining, of connecting people to the TV is at least as great in damage
Absolutely.
as the sexual abuse. And so we live in an abusive culture. And the way psychotherapy has just focused on the sexual abuse and has left the political, what we could call the political abuse, out of the discussion, is part of the mechanism that lets this abuse go on.
Well, also psychotherapy and psychology leave out the world beyond humanity, the world of nature.
Yes.
That's another absent.
The world of nature, the world of architecture. I mean, psychotherapy takes place in some kind of an atmosphere, in a room. People work. Now we're beginning to understand that there are sick buildings, and there is sick furniture, and there's sick materials, and there are noxious. We see that all in a material sense, that there are materials that affect our material body. But there are also forms that affect the soul was once imagined as the form of the body. So if there are sick forms, then the soul is being affected. So if you live or work in an atmosphere, in a physical atmosphere with ugliness, with bad architecture, with bad light, and I mean bad light meaning inhuman light, that's affecting the soul all day long. And psychotherapy not only doesn't pay attention to that, but that's considered background. It doesn't come into the hour.
Right.
Doesn't come into the group evening therapy session. And it's reduced. Then therapy tries to work that out in personal relationships. You can't work out your office structure in a personal relationship.
And you can't work out the structure of that economic system in a personal relationship. The fact that most people, through little choice of their own, not quite no choice of their own, but have little choice but to work meaningless jobs they don't like, that take up, from the time they get up till the time they get home from work, 12, 13 hours a day. And then that puts such a strain on the personal relationship. You can't just work that out in terms of personal communication if you don't bring the fact that half their day is meaningless to them into the consulting room.
See, I think a couple, instead of looking into each other's eyes and trying to battle the problems out between them, need to stand shoulder to shoulder to battle that which puts them into that place. Mm-hmm. And therapy's emphasized that personal relationship, working that out with the significant other. So it sets up an individualism that is by definition, this individual, the soul's inside this individual, and the individual can't get out of himself except with a significant other. So you're always working on your relationships.
Right.
And one of the things we've been talking about, one of the questions we've been raising, is that not only therapy, but Western thought in general, doesn't have a coherent way to address or even talk about the relationship between the individual and the collective. And the psychological relationship, the political relationship. So, for instance, most of the relationships that you see, that I see in my life, not only mine, but other people's, are usually in deep trouble. Most of the marriages fail. Even the ones that stay together aren't married. A lot of those aren't ones you'd want to be in. Now, since this is happening across such a wide scale over every part of the country and in every economic group and every sort of religious grouping, the fact that it's happening on such a huge collective scale means one of the prime reasons, at least, cannot be individual. And to put all of this on the individuals in the couple and their individual histories is what therapy does, and all therapy knows how to do at the moment. And And one of the things that this book tries to address is this is a blind spot. And the work must begin on this larger context, or you're not really treating what you say you're treating.
So the idea is that therapy takes you away from the world? Rather than
Often.
brings you into it.
Often.
Oh, yes. I don't think there's any question about therapy taking you away from the world. In its basic, yeah, go ahead. In its
I was going to say, don't you think the idea of understanding yourself better, knowing yourself better, allows you to know the world better and to understand your interaction with the world better?
I think that political skills are not taught in therapy. I think you learn, you become more sensitive, you may become more connected to your dreams, you may become more connected to your memories, you may learn certain interpersonal things in transference with your analyst or therapist, but that has nothing to do with political smarts. You learn political smarts in that way. You learn to play basketball by playing basketball. So that, I think, is one of the delusions of therapy, in which it imagines that if you become more sensitive, you'll therefore be smarter in politics. I don't see that. I don't think that those are comparable skills.
Also, when you say self, our acceptance of the word self is you alone. I wrote in Shadow Dancing, even if you're alone in a room, it's still a crowded room. They're all yourselves, and they're your descendants, and even if you don't have biological descendants,
Sure.
they're your ancestors. There's your ethnicity, there's your religion, there's your place, they're your friends. There's all of this. So we define the self, we tend to define the self in this culture and in psychotherapy very, very narrowly, where in this book, each of us in different ways tries to expand that definition of the self. So yourself is what I've just been talking about. It's also your building. It's also your community. It's also the nature around you.
It's also the other people in your dreams, as well as the other people in your memory, and all of that is there. You're living constantly in many different communities.
So if you define the self that way, then therapy isn't dealing with the self. Then therapy is leaving an enormous amount of the self out. In the book, when I asked, Jim at some point says, the consulting room should become a cell of revolution. And I said, well, how would you do that? And he says, you redefine the self as the interiorization of community. And I stepped back. Maybe you should talk about that. I stepped back a little and go, oh, yeah, that would be a revolution.
Let's do that in a moment. You're listening to Michael Ventura and James Hillman, the co-authors of We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse. We'll be right back. So James, explain the cell of revolution.
Cell of revolution, the cell of revolution. Well, let's make something clear that this is not a kind of firebrand to run out in the street and blow something up. It's not that. It's not that either. That's not the issue, because when the word revolution is used, it tends to mean people running down the street with red flags or whatever. It's more turning the whole thing over so that therapy is looking underneath its own rocks and begins to imagine all the cliches that it's using as having roots in an old idea of individualism, which was part of colonialism and industrialism. After all, therapy begins in the same 19th century, is a product of that age. And that it tries to move us from our dedication to individualism, which is the old ego and the old Western hero and the problem that keeps the white ghetto of the mind going on forever. Because I think racism is part of that enclosed structure of the white mind.
How?
How? You see, the notion of self is an individualistic idea that is based on some kind of self-enclosed soul, and everything outside of my skin is a not me. So I'm always struggling with alienation, isolation, loneliness. That's our Western, what it was called anomie 100 years ago by the French. We all feel alone, isolated. We're going to die alone. We're trying to make relationships. But that's given with this definition. Now, the cell of revolution means that in therapy, you'd begin to imagine yourself very differently. And you'd be more with yourself when you're with others than you are when you're retreating into a meditation. Now, that's a revolutionary way of thinking. It's by necessity you are with others. Man is by nature a political animal, says Aristotle. A political animal. That means he's in the flow. He's not by nature a thinking animal.
Michael said something in the book about feel most myself when I'm alone.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that jive with what James just said?
Well, when I said that, James said, which I'm not sure I buy totally, but James said, because you've been conditioned since Descartes and before that to think that, to imagine yourself as you are yourself when you're alone. And what James just said about there's another way to imagine the self. And you're going to always have a dialectic between this. The trouble with psychotherapeutic thought now and Western thought now is that there isn't this dialectic between the individual and the collective.
There's one more little piece to that. When you're actually alone in your room alone, you're usually thinking of someone else. You're not alone. Your imagination is already elsewhere. So this whole sense of I am alone, well, you know that also from Eastern disciplines, that dissolves. You are that community.
Well, in some sense, it sounds very Buddhist. You know, you're not who you think you are.
Yeah, it's got more content. It's got more content. I wouldn't say it was Buddhist.
Well, how about your term?
Unless it's EQ or something like that.
The reason I brought that up was your term kenosis, and you started talking about emptiness.
Yeah.
And I thought immediately of Buddhism and the emptiness. And
that's putting the emptiness into a kind of practice, though. I was talking about empty protest. Being willing to protest because your body reacts to something. This stinks. I can't abide this. I'm not going with this. All right, wise guy, the other people say, what would you do? What's better? Who would you vote for if you don't like this and this and this? You don't have to know the answers, but you do have to trust your reactions, your instinctual sense, which is, this is wrong and I'm against it. And that's an empty protest.
Assuming you can know the answers is also assuming you can predict what's going to happen, which is a real illusion. You know, the Whole Earth Catalog years ago said you don't have to know what a machine's going to do to invent it, or something like that. That's not an exact quote. And in terms of political action, the first step of getting your body out there, and not necessarily into the streets, but in some way, produces another situation out of which can come the unexpected, which is the answer, the provisional answer, and couldn't have been predicted. Like in Eastern Europe, there wasn't a soul in the world, not one soul in the world 4 years ago, who would have predicted that we have the situation now in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, or as we say, the former Soviet Union, that we have now. Nobody in the world would have predicted that. If you'd have told those people going out into the streets in Poland and in Germany, what's your answer to anything? You know, they wouldn't have had time to speak to you because they were in this process. And clearly, nobody had direct answers, especially the people who thought they did. You know, Lech Walesa and these other people get up there and their answers don't work because it is this long the people have initiated this long process that has a lot of messy stuff to go through before some equilibrium is reached that will be the quote-unquote answer. And so this idea of, you talk about the problems, but you don't have the solutions. Of course we don't have the solutions. Nobody has the solutions, especially the people who say they have the solutions, because everything is changing all the time.
But we're addicted to prediction. That's all we want to read about. Who's going to win the World Series? Who's going to win that's constant thing. The economists are addicted to predictions.
Well, polls is another adjunct to that, I think.
Yes.
And in many ways robs us of our democratic forms. Polling.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Well, as we speak right now, toward the end of May,
92.
92, there's all this polling about Perot and Bush and Clinton, and I don't know when this program is going to be heard, but all of that, when this program is going to be heard, all of that is going to have changed.
Yes.
In some
And
way.
all the predictions will, these are fantasies.
Yes.
That the prediction, to predict is to fantasize on incomplete information. And
information is never complete anyway.
Exactly.
So
that's what I mean. The nature of information is to be incomplete. And so we spend an awful lot of time in this culture fantasizing what the next 6 months are going to be like. And there's a lot of time we entertain ourselves literally with all those TV shows and all that stuff, doing this fantasy. Now, this is the kind of thing that psychotherapy doesn't look at, in the sense of how do you spend your entertainment time? When I was in psychotherapy as a client, I was never asked this.
Well, you're not even asked what part. When you interview candidates, you don't ask them what party they voted for. You don't interfere with or enter into their political life. That's outside. Now that's a great gap somewhere.
We analyzed my dreams. We didn't analyze the television I watched. We analyzed my relationships, but we didn't analyze my relation to my work. And partly because psychotherapy over the last 100 years has developed some very good ways to delineate and talk about and differentiate these personal things. And there's this blind spot. It hasn't developed that kind of dialogue, the vocabulary to deal with these other things. And we're not saying let's go out and invent a new jargon. We are, each of us, saying this has to be spoken of.
I'm speaking with Michael Ventura and James Hillman, the co-authors of We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse. You're listening to New Dimensions, and my name is Michael Toms. James, do you think there's a planetary psyche? As Michael brought up what's happened in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and in some sense, it may be that the Russians hit bottom and recognize it. We've hit bottom and haven't recognized it. And so with the relationship of our national karma, psyche, whatever, soul, to that.
That's too big a question for me. I prefer to talk about the psyche of the ashtray or the microphone or the light bulb or something. In other words, the psyche for me is the soul in things which displays itself through qualities. It's a qualitative perception that you get into the images of things. Ideas of world soul or national or planetary are just too large and metaphysical. They don't seem to be psychological ideas.
Let me take you to one of your statements in the book, and let me paraphrase from it. The world is in extremis because we don't go to extremes.
Yeah. Well, maybe because we don't go to extremes, but it certainly is a time to go to extremes because the world is in extremis. And that would suggest we need to keep moving our minds. That's one of our great gifts, is that we human beings have minds and can use our minds. To think equally desperately, equally radically, equally passionately as the condition of the plants, the rivers, the cities, I mean, the world around us.
So the individual does have power to change the world.
The individual has power to change the world.
By going to more extreme action, and the world will change as a result of that?
I can't answer.
Uh-huh.
Can't answer. You're setting it up in a way that I can't deal with. That creates, you see, that's a heroic fantasy.
Yes.
Of which there's the heroic individual, and he changes and grows, and then the world will change and grow. I don't see it that way. There's a job to be done, which is to free the mind to think its thoughts, and then you'll see what happens.
Yeah, there's this phrase that you see on bumper strips on cars, think globally, act locally. And I guess what I'm driving at is the connection between the personal and the larger reality. You know,
it's funny. I was thinking, as you said that, of another phrase you see on bumper stickers on cars, which we can paraphrase for the FCC, that stuff happens. And in the sense of your question about does the individual have the power to change the world? Well, that does lead all of us into heroic thinking. But do folks individually and collectively, if they do stuff in their lives, is there a ripple effect, and does that make stuff happen on these various smaller planes? Yes, that's obviously true. History is not a spectator sport. If you're involved, you're making history. If you're not involved, you're making history. If you're buying food at a health food store, you're making a little bit of history. If you're buying it at the Mayfair, you're making another kind of history. All these choices you make all through the day are political. There's nothing that are historical.
Absolutely.
And
if you go to a small bookstore, you're doing something which is different than going to a large chain bookstore.
And so one of the things that the question does, can the individual change the world, is overlook the fact that the individuals all are changing the world, and that everything we do has all these ripple effects. And part of what we're talking about in the book is the consciousness of this perhaps can juice up, focus, jazz up that effect.
Well, a lot of people,
that's hopeful. But I mean, 8 years of Ronald Reagan changed the world too. You see what I mean when you talk about the individual changing the world. And what worries me is that psychotherapeutic metaphysical fantasy that if I get myself in order, the world's going to get in order. I'm worried about that. I think the individual can change the world just as much by getting out in the street as by working on himself. I think that's part of why we put the book together, the title together. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. That "and" suggests there's some correlation between it.
Right. Well,
I don't want us to go back into thinking that if we just work on ourselves in our personal way, the world will get better. That's what I'm worried about.
Right. What about the sense of hopelessness and people feeling disempowered and unable to do anything, to change anything?
I think we talk about that in the book. We say that the psychotherapy has emphasized the inner child, and the voice in one that feels disempowered and unable to change anything and abused by everything around one. The victim voice is the voice of that inner child, which psychotherapy keeps reinforcing. So there's another angle where psychotherapy and the backing off from the political comes out of that inner child work, or is connected to the inner child work. The more we focus on the inner child, the less we are politically engaged.
Last night, somebody at a talk we were giving mentioned the sense of hopelessness, and you just mentioned it. And I realized as you mentioned it that I'm getting aggravated by it. I don't mean by the question. I mean by there's some assumption in the idea of what about this sense of hopelessness that is enervating people, that I'm stuttering around trying to put my finger on it, that assumes that if you have some kind of a clear answer, then you're going to break through the fog of the hopelessness, which is the temptation. I know last night, when you're asked a question like that, you try to give them that sort of answer. You immediately slide smack into the archetype. And I don't think it's a question of hopelessness. I think it's a question of vitality. I think
Absolutely.
I think anything approached with a certain sort of vitality, that, what am I trying to say?
We don't need hope. We need imagination. We need vitality. We need reaction. We need response. We need enjoyment.
We need more soul.
Yeah, but we also need what I just said. Before you see what I mean? This problem of hope, give up hope. You don't need hope. Pandora's story is that hope's the last evil that's in Pandora's jar. Hope is one of the evils. Hope is a constant delusional thing.
There's a sense
we don't need hope. If we don't have hope, you don't have despair. You get rid of both of them. What you need is activity, vitality, imagination.
There's a sense in which, if one needs hope in order to live, it's like saying one needs an excuse in order to live, and we have to dispense with those excuses, because it really takes us out of the present. Hope is a way of asking the future, which doesn't exist, to confirm the present, which is just past and doesn't exist either. It's you're right. This does sound a little Buddhist. I didn't mean it. But
Crossing the line here.
but
Courage. We need more courage than hope, because that's involvement.
hope assumes, when people are asking for hope, they're asking for some assurance that maybe can we win? Whatever our program is, maybe can we win? Maybe can we get it? And what's been lost is, not only in America, but in many cultures today, the sort of Alamo, if you want to get heroic, thing of sometimes you fight even though you can't win.
It's a luxury to know you're going to win, or to be on the winning side. That's a luxury.
And to see what happens. The idea of struggling just with that hope of winning is stymieing a great deal of political thought and action in this country today.
So it's embracing I hear you're suggesting that we embrace everything in life, that we embrace the highs and the lows, that we embrace the suffering as much as the highlights.
I'm not sure
We live it fully.
If embrace means a wrestler's grip, I'm with you. If embrace means non-discriminating acceptance, I'm not with you.
Sure.
Yeah, and there's that. Yes, non-discriminating acceptance is a great evil, and it's practiced in various ways by all sorts of factions in this country. You have it politically, the people who accepted whatever Reagan said as the truth, and you have it in the New Age as everything is perfect. The idea that this is all going along according to God's plan of one sort or another, so don't worry about it. It's both non-discriminating acceptance, and it just gets too mushy.
It's not only that, your body won't do it. Your body has instantaneous likes and dislikes and reactions, and you can't quell that in the name of a larger philosophy of acceptance or forgiveness or any of the others. I mean, we've been preached that stuff for so long, that isn't the issue any longer. The issue is vitality and reaction and enjoyment. Enjoyment, gets lost a lot.
Yes. One of the things that was intrigued me was the idea of living life backwards. Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's a long letter in the book where I'm writing to Michael about seeing the world not in terms of that my childhood is formative and causal on the way I am today, so that we always have to go back into history to find out how I got this way. When we ask the question, what's wrong with me in our culture, we always find out that it had something to do with the past. And that whole letter is about imagining your life as from the future forward. Well, that isn't it either. How can I say that? Do you want to lead me into that from what you read of it?
I had written down, imagining life in reverse, live backwards in significance. So
the way you should get at it is talking about developmental psychology. Your argument with developmental
essential psychology versus developmental
essential psychology versus development. Because most psychology that we all grew up with and live with, go to college to learn or wherever else, is in terms of development. My history is my causality. What happened to me when I was 3 months, 4 years, whatever it is the cause of the way I am now. So it becomes my mother and my father and my childhood. No other culture imagines that way. All other cultures, if something's wrong with me, imagines in terms of spirits or food or taboos or rituals I didn't perform or something in the atmosphere or spells cast on me or something else, but never would it be imagined that it's what happened by my mother and my father to me 40 years ago. I'm out of my mind for completely other reasons in other cultures, tribal and other societies and other terms of history. Now, if you think about life lived backwards, there would be some essential characteristics in my nature that are always there, as with Churchill, who stuttered and had speech difficulties and writing difficulties and spelling difficulties in school. Of course, at the age of 13, 14, 15, he couldn't handle the English language, because on the English language, for which he won the Nobel Prize in Literature much later in his life, his speeches saved the Western world from Hitler. So that was a destiny. That was an essential part of his structure. And he wasn't up to it at 13 or 14. The same thing talk about Maniletti, the bullfighter, who when he was 9 years old was terrified, hung around his mother in the kitchen, was always afraid. Ordinary developmental psychology would say he compensated and he became a bullfighter in order to overcome this weakness. But I'm imagining that he knew, the psyche somewhere knew, that he was to meet 1,000-pound black bulls with great horns when he was 9 years old. That was in his destiny. And he wasn't up to it. So, of course, he was in terror as a child. So the structure is given as a destiny, as a seed, as an acorn, as an essence. And the pathology that children have, or that you have in your youth, is very often the manifestations of that destiny happening in a way that mean you're not up to it, you can't handle it. So it's only when you're much, much older that all that stuff begins to show in another way, as Churchill's speech difficulties become his gift. In other words, there are gifts there, and these appear as pathological hindrances when you're young.
So how does this relate to fate? I mean, are we fated to be a certain something? Do we come in with innate?
I think we come absolutely. We don't come in as a blank slate. We come in a platonic sense with touched by the gods, given a particular task, a karma, whatever language you want to use. And the lifetime job is the discovery of that.
And at the same time, you don't want to fall into the trap of predestination and those kinds of ideas. Churchill didn't know he was going to save the world from Hitler, and Maniletti didn't know he was going to be the greatest.
It took Hitler for him to save the world, too.
True.
Right.
So the whole thing is much more complex than that.
Just like it took Judas to betray Jesus.
It's much more complex. It's not a simple predestination than you find out what your destiny is and you do it. But your pathology, your early pathology is all those places where things aren't right or aren't adaptive are ways of coming to discover what's wanted of you.
There's so much of our world today, so much of our society suppresses the invisible world. The invisible, in general, is not really looked at, excuse the pun. But one of the things, you brought up the movie Harvey, which is a great film for those who are familiar with it, where Jimmy Stewart's walking around with this invisible rabbit that's 6 foot tall. And this was bringing home, the reason you brought up Harvey was the importance of that invisible companion that we all have, or the invisible companions we have around us. Can we talk a little bit about that and why that's important and why it's important to bring that out more?
I include that in a sense of community, that it is not just this world that we can see, that we have a community with, and the feeling of whether you call them projections, well, whatever you're going to call them, if you get clinical about them, if you believe in their quote unquote reality, whatever that is,
schizophrenic or whatever,
schizophrenic, whatever, that we see them in dreams. We have all kinds of, Harvey is a modern myth of that. There's a lot of negative modern myth of that we call horror films.
And multiple personalities, and
multiple,
aliens, and so on. Yeah,
and UFOs. UFOs would fit that in.
So, if we look at this stuff as part of our community, as individuals, as a group, that shifts the equation considerably. I don't have any grand pronouncements about how it shifts the equation or about what you do with it. I do know that it does shift the equation, and then that world becomes, what you're dealing with becomes different. That world becomes, I don't even want to say bigger.
It says a lot about the teenage world of today, that many teenagers are living in a community of horror and living in a community of highly destructive alien forces that they don't know much about. And to put all those into their own fantasy is not an answer. Those are communal figures. They're like ancestral voices. If they were on another island in another time, in another tribe, in another society, they would be regarded as demonic inhabitants of that village.
For instance,
so there's a lot being said about what's going on in the youth of the culture by the kinds of community that they are in.
For instance, Freddy of Nightmare on Elm Street has become a cult figure, and even an affectionate cult figure in this society. Now, this is a child killer, and he's become an affectionate cult figure among children. Now, as a film,
dolls of Freddy and T-shirts,
and so the T-shirts and dolls of a child killer. This is very interesting.
Yes.
That as a film critic, I have a great deal of respect for those Nightmare on Elm Street movies. They're not just psycho killer movies, and they're rented by children all over the world. We're not talking about perverts renting them. We're talking about the children renting them. And what's the structure of these movies? How does Freddy work? Freddy goes into the child's dream and kills the child in the child's dream. This is not something happening in the outer world over here. This is definitely a contemporary myth of a demon that many, many, many children are feeling.
So we're back at the beginning, what we were talking about, that there is a demonic child abuser, a child killer in the culture, killing children.
And these movies are one way children are recognizing it and coping in their emotional life with this fact of their society.
So when they go to school, an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old goes to school with a gun, this is part of the child killer that's living it out, or living on the streets, or not being fed. 1/7 of the children in the country are not getting adequate meals, and so on and so forth. The child killer is all over as part of the life of the child.
And then what the government and what people on all sides of the political spectrum do is blame this on the movies and like that. I find this to be such a historically blind argument. Most of the great atrocities of our history, including 20th century history, the people who operated the concentration camps had never watched television and had not seen any of our horror movies. The people who committed the atrocities in Cambodia had never seen any of these movies, never watched television. This is not something coming from the media. This is something being expressed by the media. And so I just wanted to make that point because it's something folks immediately jump to.
Well, for an example, what happened in the recent LA riots, where television was right on the scene and they were showing live pictures of stores being looted. And in some sense, there was some criticism of this because there was the sense that people were motivated to go out, more people were motivated to go out and loot stores because they were seeing it live on television happening. And there was the idea that people were this was being promoted by live television.
I would follow Michael's point and say that the looting is endemic to the society. It's what the SNL scandals are. It was one of the greatest lootings. We've been looted by the government for the last 12 years. Our tax-paying, the scandals in the defense contracts, we're being looted constantly. The looting that we saw on TV was a tiny little thing. It was like a six-pack compared to the massive looting that we're all experiencing and is endemic in the society. So TV simply presents images, concrete images of the looting. You can't see the SNL looting.
Right. Doonesbury did, though.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the points that was made, I believe, was in your letter, one of your letters, Michael, about the Book of Revelation and the multi-headed beast challenging all the laws and the end of the world. It was being seen by the early writers of the Bible that this beast was the rising of the unconscious, and surely it was going to be the end of the world as they knew it.
Well, I'll try to explain the metaphor a little bit as I see it. You have in the Book of Revelations the multi-limbed, multi-headed beast coming out of the sea. Well, from antiquity to Jung and Freud to now, the sea has always been the symbol of the psyche, of the unconscious. So this beast is not coming out of an ocean over there, it's coming out of us. Now this multi-headed, the quality of the beast is simultaneity. And we live in a world of incredible simultaneity and displacement in time. The three of us are talking now. These voices are going to be broadcast at other times, in other places, and they're going to be coming at people while the three of us are asleep. It's this very strange multi-world we live in. And all of this dreamlike quality in our waking world. We go out, especially in America, we walk out the door and there's these images of sex, images of waterfalls, and all this advertising imagery, we turn on the TV and flick around and we see all ages of history. There's this crazy simultaneity going on that only used to exist in dreams. And so in this sense, the image in Revelations is the dream life coming out of the unconscious and walking on the world. Well, that's what we have now. The dream life has come out of the unconscious and is walking on the world. And that's what we call modern society. Now, in Revelations, they said this is the moment before the apocalypse, before the end. And one of the things I said in this piece is, well, maybe it is definitely the end of a way of looking at the world. It is the end of a lot of rules about the world. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's getting a mite too concrete to say it's the end of the world, and maybe that's a wish. Maybe the wish is, if our world is being contradicted on such our what they call values are being contradicted on such a massive scale, then maybe the world should end. So I think there's a wish in that. I don't think it's concrete, though.
Yeah. So we've been, I feel like there's a lot more we could talk about, but we're running out of time. And I really want to thank both of you for being with us today.
Well, thank you.
Running out of time.
Running out of time. Time is the fourth partner in our dialogue.
Well, we just finished talking about the apocalypse. So we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Pick up if you're there.
Well, somehow let me say that what I think you've both said does provide, may I say, hopefulness, or a vision at least of how the world looks different from a different perspective with new questions. And perhaps our listeners will go away with a little more vitality for life.
Hope so. Thank you.
Thanks again. I've been speaking with Michael Ventura and James Hillman, the co-authors of We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse, published by HarperCollins. My name is Michael Toms. On behalf of the New Dimensions radio staff and all those who are members of Friends of New Dimensions, I'm wishing you well.
You've been listening to a New Dimensions archive edition, recorded in 1992. New Dimensions Radio has been making a difference on our planet since 1973, thanks to the generosity of our listeners. You too can help make a difference with a tax-deductible donation or membership. Please visit our website, newdimensions.org, and just click the Donate button.